Hi, everybody. I'm a historian of Victorian popular culture. And I have a sort of a wide range of interests in different kinds of pop culture. And sport is one of them that I'm gradually drifting into, but I'm very conscious I'm sort of an imposter here. I'm not a proper sports historian. But I do want to talk about things that I think intersect with sports history in some interesting ways, and perhaps make some connections with other forms of leisure and popular culture that we might not normally think about. But before we do that, I want to start with a story, a rather unusual story, I think. And it's one that took place on the 16th of June, 1898, at Wood Green Cycle Track in London. It was a great transatlantic showdown between two competitors, one from Britain, one from America. But they weren't cyclists. In the red corner was a man named Edward Harper, 27 years old, 5'8.5" from Deptford. And in the blue corner, his American competitor was Paul Tetzel, age 31, 5'7" from Chicago. It was a big event. There were about 4,000 people had gathered at the cycle track to watch this. Placards had been going out all around London. It had all the hallmarks of a great transatlantic prize fight. But they weren't boxers. They were, in fact, and rather bizarrely, butchers. This was, as it was billed at the time, the Great International Beef Dressing Contest, which they took part in for an astonishing £200 a side, and the World Championship. Not that this was a particularly prestigious event, but nevertheless, this is how it went down. I'll explain exactly what it involved. Before the main event started, there were some interesting diversions. First things first, the crowd, as I say, about 4,000 people, were entertained by a man named J.H. Herbert, a trick cyclist, first man to ride backwards from London to Brighton, I think. Perhaps the last, I don't know. After this, or rather appropriately, came out the musical performance, which was a marrowbone and cleaver band, a group of butchers sort of banging together their cleavers and marrowbones in a sort of rhythmic song. Eventually, though, it was time for the main event, and it's a rather gruesome one, I'm afraid. First things first, 4 bullocks had to be slaughtered. These are the actual bullocks who took part in this event. Looking rather happy at this point, I guess, but it wouldn't last. For reasons of decency, the actual slaughtering of the bullocks took place behind a curtain, but apparently you could see the shadow of the poleaxe coming down on them, so rather unpleasant. But after that was done, it was time for the proper event, and I do have a photograph of what this involved. There was an enormous platform erected in the middle of the cycling track where the butchers did their work. And basically the idea was you had to skin, hoist, and then dress 2 carcasses in as quick a time as possible. So it was sort of essentially butchery against the clock. Presented as a spectator sport. And these are the results. Place your bets now. Edward Harper managed to do his 2 carcasses in a pretty respectable 20 minutes and 22 seconds. But the American Paul Tetzel did it in 18 minutes, 32 seconds. America came out on top. Now, it's interesting to see the kind of press coverage this got when the British press tried to make sense of why an American had won this trade. And they admitted that he was very skillful, but they particularly said he was fast. This is a thing that's often used to describe Americans. They're energetic, very modern. Whereas the British one, of course, even though he lost, butchered the carcasses with a great deal of more artistry and refinement and culture. And this, the reason I mention this is that this kind of distinction between America as new, modern, energetic, fast, big, and usually winning, and Britain as artistic and refined is sort of a part of a transatlantic leisure culture, a wider discourse, if you like, that spreads out a whole range of different contexts in which Britain and America encountered one another. Now, this is, I'll admit, a really odd event. It's not the kind of thing that was held every year. In fact, Parliament got involved and sort of prevented them from happening ever again. I think they thought it was just a bit too gruesome. But the reason I'm mentioning it at the start here is because in my own research, I sort of use this as an example of a much broader set of connections and encounters between people in Britain and America that took place in sporting contests, in print, in theatres, in shops, in pubs. And that's what I'm doing. This is what my research is at the moment. I'm writing a book on how ordinary people in Victorian Britain encountered, discussed, and responded to America. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. In some respects, it's a project that I'm really enjoying. I've been working on it for far too long, 6 or 7 years. And it's because I just keep finding more weird things like this that I want to talk about, more unusual encounters and exchanges. And I'm trying to still figure out a way to sort of condense them into an actual book. it's even harder to condense them into a 40-minute talk, but what I've tried to do is just pick out what I think are some of the most interesting transatlantic cultural encounters happening at this time period, some of which we might know about, some of which you might not. And I'm not going to talk a great deal about sport, but I guess what I'm suggesting we keep in mind is that a lot of the sporting encounters that happened in this period, whether they're between boxers, cyclists, swimmers, yachtsmen, whether it's touring baseball teams, and actually whenever I talk to sports historians, they always tell me of another great one that I've got to investigate. What I would suggest is we keep those in mind and kind of think about how those responses to transatlantic sporting encounters intersected with other cultural encounters that I'm going to talk about today. I think they're very much part of the same discourse. We can't understand things like this without understanding transatlantic boxing matches and vice versa. So, what I'm trying to do, though, as part of this project, I guess, is to rethink the history of Americanization, which is something that has been written about a fair bit. And the vast majority of research on this subject focuses on the 20th century, as we'd expect, right? A lot of it focuses on the post-war period. I guess this is the time of Coca-Cola, Levi jeans, appropriately enough, Elvis Presley, movies, drive-ins, all those kind of icons of modern post-war American consumerism. Occasionally, people will push this history a little bit further back and maybe think about the interwar period, the Jazz Age, a time of new music, new sounds, new urban landscapes. And of course, the most important thing, the arrival in Britain of Hollywood movies, that great vehicle for showing off modern America and getting new audiences excited about life on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, aside from some notable exceptions, and there are some, I think the history of, if you like, Americanization in the Victorian period, I don't think has been looked at enough. And in fact, there is a real tendency in a lot of this scholarship to really draw a line, to sort of think in terms of the American century on this side and the kind of heyday of British power and imperialism on the other side. And as I say, there are some people who do cross this line, but this is, in broad strokes, the way in which the story of Britain and America is usually told. And the idea, I guess, is that we find it very difficult to imagine scenes like this, with the Victorians with their top hats and extraordinary sideburns, encountering and engaging with America in the ways we're used to. And I guess what I'm trying to do in my research is take Victorians who look, I guess, something a bit like this chap, and start to say, can we reimagine them? Can we extend the history of Americanization and perhaps start to think of them as something a little bit more like this? Now, hot dogs and I Love New York t-shirts were not around in the 19th century, but I think, if you like, the roots of that fascination with America, that turbulent love affair that we have with America to this day, has deep roots, and they start in the middle of the 19th century, and they are enabled and developed through leisure culture in particular, and through a wide range of different types of leisure culture, of which sport is one. Now, if you look at most scholarship which examines, if you like, Victorian responses to America, actually, I mean, sports history is one of the areas that has actually moved beyond this, but a lot of work for a long time focused on the opinions of a relatively small group of travellers, usually writers, who visited America almost as if they were kind of visiting a peculiar exhibit to see how this new country was developing. And almost every sort of British writer who went to America immediately felt compelled to write a book about it on their return. In fact, that came sort of running joke in their introductions. They would say, oh yeah, another book about America, but hey, I'm going to do it anyway. And these books are interesting, but for a long time they have really shaped the way in which we think the Victorians thought about America, which is largely to dismiss it, or to look down their noses, to see it as uncultured, uncouth, a little bit of an upstart nation where people spit and the streets are not paved properly, where things are a little bit wilder and unrefined. And that, I think, has sort of dominated a lot of scholarship in terms of Victorian responses to America. The problem I have with this, and it's very valuable, the opinions of these people are important, we should look at them, but to say that they are the Victorians, that they are representative of a nation, I think is rather problematic. I mean, for starters, I could find pictures of all of them on Wikipedia, which immediately start to tell us that these are not ordinary people. And of course, the success of America, its great triumph in the 20th century, was never really over the critical classes. It was never over the literary elites. It was over ordinary people. You know, people who were buying Levi jeans, drinking Coca-Cola, going to the cinema. And I guess what I'm trying to do is figure out, well, okay, how do ordinary, using that word in a very sort of casual sense, but how do ordinary Victorians encounter and think about America? And can we sort of see in those responses that the start of that sort of fascination with American popular culture that we're so familiar with today? So that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been trying to unpack. And I've been looking for sort of ways to do that. My PhD focused very much on newspapers. That's my main interest. I'm mainly a historian of print culture. But what I want to do today is talk a little bit more about that broader leisure culture, which newspapers, performance, sport intersect. First things first, though, if we sort of start to think about this broad question, how does an ordinary person, let's say, living in Crewe in the 1880s, how do they encounter America? In what situations would they be confronted with America? Well, it's worth pointing out that by sort of the end, final decades of the 19th century, transatlantic travel was becoming easier, more accessible, and the Titanic looms large over all this, doesn't it? But it was by and large safer, if we kind of ignore that one. And it was often talked about as being boring now, that it was no longer a terrifying trip that you would sort of have to really sort of gird yourself up for. It was the kind of thing where you enjoy opulent dinner parties and play games and chat with people. So it is becoming popular and more accessible. And in fact, what you start to see as part of this leisure culture, I guess, is the emergence of a tourism industry of sorts. You could go to tourist offices in Manchester, in Liverpool, and buy a sort of package holiday to America, which would involve one of these railway tickets, a bit like you can still get in Europe, where you could kind of travel a particular route that would take you to all the key sites, Niagara Falls, the national parks, New York, Chicago. And in fact, you can see all these different lines that were being advertised here and the agents where you could buy them. I'll just flick through a few more. But you can kind of see them which they're branded. These are the sites you must see in America if you're going to go. If you're going to go, of course, you also need your camera, you need your dictionary of Americanisms so you can understand what on earth they're saying, and you need your guidebook as well, that kind of thing that's going to tell you everything you see out of your train window. There is an industry emerging, in other words, which is saying to ordinary, or maybe not ordinary, but saying to more British people than before, America is a place you can visit. It's not all about emigration. You can go there for a few weeks. But there's a problem with this. The Pall Mall Gazette, one of the kind of great middle-class newspapers of this period, published a series of articles explaining how you could go on this trip. And in the end, they summarised what you would really need in order to do it. Two things are essential to a complete success of a tour in America, they said: time and money. And it's a lot of time and a lot of money. To do the country properly, one ought to be prepared to spend several months there, 6 months if possible. So imagine going to your boss and saying, I'll just offer a 6-month holiday in America. The vast majority of people would not be able to do that. You simply can't kind of get out of work in that kind of way if you belong to the working and lower middle classes. In terms of money, £200 or £250 would cover the thing pretty comfortably, which sounds all right to us. In Victorian money, that is an astronomical amount of money, several years' wages for a labourer. So in other words, what we can start to see, this industry is there, but it is out of the reach of the vast majority, 95%, of people in Britain. However, there was another way to cross the Atlantic, another way to explore those landscapes rather than buying a train ticket. As the Spectator newspaper said in its coverage of the Chicago exhibition, they said, "The visit to Chicago, which even the most stay-at-home portion of the world will make through its newspapers, will enable them to realise the great change that is coming over America." This is the kind of thing I'm interested in. It's almost vicarious tourism, of sitting at home, of reading, of going to the theatre, of going to exhibitions, and experiencing and encountering a foreign landscape that is still somehow physically inaccessible to you. And so these are some of the things I want to look at today. It's worth just sort of talking a little bit about how this sort of culture of connection between Britain and America was encouraged and enabled and how it changed. And I've got an interesting example of this. So when President Lincoln was assassinated in the 1860s, it took over a week for that news to get to Britain. So you've got to imagine America is in crisis, the country is in meltdown, meanwhile a steamship is gradually tracking across the Atlantic. People in Britain have no idea. There is this extraordinary lag that makes it very difficult to feel as if you're kind of inhabiting the same cultural or mental world. Fast forward to the 1880s, when President Garfield is shot. I love this photo. It kind of just looks like he's put his back out, doesn't it? But he has been shot in the back. Unlike Lincoln, he doesn't die immediately. He's on, if you like, his deathbed for quite some time. At this point, less than 20 years later, the Times newspaper in England is telegraphed regular, like every few hours, updates on his pulse and temperature. With every edition of the Times that you bought in London, you could essentially feel the pulse of a dying president on the other side of the Atlantic. And of course, the thing that enabled that was the eventual kind of building of the Atlantic telegraph cable, here celebrated as the 8th wonder of the world. This is an absolutely extraordinary achievement, laying a cable under the Atlantic and allowing people, as Freedom's champion, the American newspaper said, to feel as if the Atlantic Ocean had been dried up. The ocean is spanned, they said. Storms cannot delay nor calms retard the thoughts which one continent speaks to another. We shall hereafter read in the morning papers at breakfast the news of events transpiring in Europe the day before. Two great nations speaking the same language have annihilated space and time and will henceforth talk to each other as friends standing side by side. Now, it's fair to say that this cable, it was astronomically expensive to send even like a couple of words along the cable at first. So this idea of two countries chatting idly didn't necessarily emerge for quite some time later. But this is a kind of a metaphor for the things I'm interested in. Increasing connection, entanglement between the two countries, and the ways in which people on both sides of the Atlantic were brought into contact with one another. And this has an interesting effect. Over time, as this graph shows, this is a search for the word America, or variations on America, and the word United States in 29 British newspapers. I sort of selected a representative sample from the period. And I was just looking for how many articles make reference to these terms. So this is a spike in the 1860s. This is the height of the Civil War. If you think about it, this is like the great media event of the century for America. And it makes perfect sense that this was a time when British newspapers were extensively discussing what was going on in the United States. It was, in fact, one of the key moments in which British people began to understand the geography of America, reading battle reports. There are stories of school teachers having maps of the United States in their classroom, and as week by week the reports came in, teaching children about the United States that way. Now that's supposedly the most important event of the century for America. But look at this. By the 1880s, a time when, in a lot of historiography of this period, nothing is happening. There is no great tension between Britain and America, no great conflict. References to the United States are the same as at the peak of the Civil War. And that tells us something interesting, I think, the way in which America is increasingly being embedded in the everyday reading experiences of the British public. And it happens in all sorts of journalistic contexts, from news stories through to serialized fiction, as we'll see in a bit, through to jokes. One of the most potentially seemingly least interesting ones that I want to just kind of mention, though, are these market reports, which I guess drift us slightly away from leisure culture, but you'll see where I'm going in a minute. Looking at these kind of things, it's not the kind of reading material that you would kind of necessarily look forward to every day, but what you would get are these closing prices at the New York Stock Exchange reported around Britain the next day. So you could take part, if you like, in the American market, and to feel as if you can kind of do it in almost the same way as you could in New York. You can respond to crises, take up kind of opportunities in new ways. And what's interesting for me is that even if you weren't reading this stuff, it kind of starts to occupy an increasingly sort of large position in the corner of your eye if you're a reader. I'll show you what I mean. This is the Leeds Mercury, a kind of classic provincial newspaper from the time. The yellow sections are their commercial news. The red bits are references to America. So this is 1876. Not much, a few little pieces. 1886, it's starting to grow. By 1896, there is an entire dedicated section with American markets right at the top. Even if you're flicking past that stuff to get to the sports results, you see it. It's kind of there. It forms the background of your life, even if you're not focusing on it directly. And what I find interesting is that these tensions, these ideas about American money, and what was often termed the almighty dollar, start to play out in some other interesting ways too. These are ways that actually I've only just started to explore, so these are very provisional ideas. But one of the most interesting concerns this chap, Jumbo the elephant, who a lot of you will have heard of. It's where we get the term Jumbo from, meaning big. He was one of the star attraction at London Zoo, absolutely beloved by the public, until he is bought by P.T. Barnum, the great American showman, who has a great deal of money behind him, money that London Zoo can't refuse. And there is astonishing sort of uproar in Britain that the idea that America has managed to buy one of their star attractions, one of the great sort of status symbols of the capital. I need to investigate this more. I did hear recently that a brick was thrown through the window of the American consulate in London after Barnum tried to do this. So you can kind of see, even in popular culture, we see these moments where America is being maybe resisted, or people are starting to sort of come to terms with this idea that America might be able to outspend Britain. And what does that mean for British pride, Britain's future? Another interesting and sort of similar sort of form are the dollar princesses, those wealthy American heiresses who would come and marry bankrupt English lords. The heiresses would get the title, the lords would get the money. And these were discussed a great deal in society columns, in gossip columns. It was something that even if you didn't circle in the kind of, this is Consuelo Vanderbilt here, even if you didn't circle in the kind of these rarefied atmospheres, you would read about them in newspapers and start to sort of get the sense, this idea that America has this financial power, that Britain needs it. And in fact, it starts to play out in jokes. Here's the first Victorian joke of the day. Spinning a mine, it's called. Lord Lackland appropriately says, Miss Vandenbloom, I love you. Say you will be mine. To which Miss Vandenbloom, an American millionaire, says, well, my lord, I reckon I can never be any man's, but you can be mine, if you like. It's this kind of playing with this idea that now, the American woman has this power. And America, this obviously symbolises America more generally, I think. Some other interesting occasions in which competition between Britain and America's growing power were discussed and interpreted were Wild West shows, appropriately enough. This is, if you like, the birth of that culture that would later lead people to the Dude Ranch, this fascination, this sort of a manufactured myth of the West. The most famous one, of course, is Buffalo Bill. William Cody, who we see here, is probably one of the most famous Americans of the 19th century, alongside Thomas Edison and Mark Twain, probably, I would say. He comes to Britain in 1887, takes up residence at Earl's Court at the American Exhibition, and is phenomenally popular. Like, he is the absolute sensation of the year. Queen Victoria visits many times. It is extraordinarily popular. He tours the rest of Britain afterwards as well. You can kind of see some of his other promotional material here. If you've never sort of encountered these before, these are kind of restagings of all those kind of tropes of the Western. You know, the attack on the stagecoach, rescuing the woman who's tied up at the stake by Indians. You know, cowboys always coming out on top, of course. You know, the Indians are always beaten. It's a way of sort of mythologizing the white man's triumph, I guess, over Native Americans. And Buffalo Bill is really famous. I mean, there is a whole industry around him of penny dreadfuls, of newspaper columns, of souvenirs. And I find him interesting, you know, and even for that year or two that he's in Britain, obviously he's incredibly famous. But there is I guess one of the points I'm trying to make in my project is that Britain's encounters with America are not limited to these one-off blockbuster events. They're going on at a whole number of levels. And there are lots of, if you like, cut-price Buffalo Bills who are circling around the provinces while he is making it big in London. And here are some of my favourites. On the left, we have Mustang Ned, extraordinarily dressed as some kind of musketeer, he looks like almost. Here is his tagline. The famous Western scout, bushranger, buffalo hunter, and savage elephant subjugator. You don't often see elephants in Wild West movies, do you? I think there is a kind of sort of blurring of the lines here. This guy I love. I've been doing a lot of work on him. Mexican Joe, who is genuinely the cut-price Buffalo Bill. When Buffalo Bill is in London and he's been patronised by royalty, you know, circling in the highest echelons of society, he's the kind of the lion of the season. Mexican Joe is over in America and thinks, I'd like a bit of that. But he can't go to London. He can't set up shop directly opposite Buffalo Bill, so he comes to Liverpool. And he, you know, there is extraordinary stories in the Liverpool press as he's on a steamship, and him and his sort of Wild West troop of cowboys and Indians and animals are coming over. And there's this great quote in one of them where it says, it's so excitedly, even now as you read this, Mexican Joe stands astride a steamship, his moustache flapping in the breeze. You know, and so there is this great celebrity culture building around these cowboys. And as far as I can see, Mexican Joe, he may have had some extraordinary adventures in Texas. He's always described as being very famous there. I can't find many references to him. He feels like a kind of manufactured celebrity who arrives in Chicago, in New York, with all these tales of what he's got up to. Just like Buffalo Bill, a lot of his stories are complete fabrications. In fact, you can kind of see that he comes armed with a whole range of cowboys with extraordinary names. What have we got? So we've got Tex Marshall, a noted cowboy detective, Young Buffalo, son of Old Buffalo, was a buffalo hunter, Yellowstone Vic, Mustang Ned, Comanche Dan, Rocky Mountain Jack, Arizona Joe, Arizona Pete, Montana Bill, all these kind of people who've got these kind of elements of America embedded in their names. And there are loads of these guys circulating around provincial theatres in Britain, doing small-scale versions of what Buffalo Bill himself was doing. And these guys have an interesting effect. The British public goes nuts for the Wild West in the 1870s, and it's a fascination that continues for decades afterwards. And where this fits into this sort of narrative of American competition, and then perhaps anxieties about America's emerging place in the world, I guess are quite interesting, I think. So the first thing is that young boys in Liverpool start sending letters to Mexican Joe begging to run away with him. This is the call of the West. It's like the Dude Ranch again. It's this sort of this desire to escape your humdrum life and find yourself on the frontier. So here's one, a boy from Liverpool that was printed in a newspaper. I hope you have thoughts of the letter I sent you. I hear every day that you want boys, so I should like to see you in private. I've tried to get 3p to come and see you because I'm sure you will like me. I can sing, fence, shoot. I don't mean to say that I'm a marksman, but I know how to handle one. I'm waiting outside for an answer. So there is this poor sort of young lad sitting outside the Wild West show, can't even afford to go in, is desperate to escape Liverpool and to sort of reinvent himself on the West. Whether Mexican Joe ever even lived that life is up for debate, I guess. Two young boys wrote another letter. They said, "Is it true that you advertise for some young boys in the Weekly Post to go away with your troop to America? If so, I should very much like to get the satisfaction to go with you. As I'm getting tired of this town, I should like to have a change in your country, in the same game of life, or to do anything with you. I should very much like to go away with you and to join in with you. So you can kind of start to see, again, this fantasy of America emerging through popular culture, through Wild West shows, through the dime novels that were being sold alongside these performances. The allure of the West, the allure of America, an entirely manufactured America, nevertheless, is there very much. Girls respond in a slightly different way to Mexican Joe and his cowboys. Here we have a letter from a young woman. Dear sir, a pair of young women actually, we beg to ask you if you have a vacancy for 2 young girls. We are 16 and have had no experience, but we should do our best to give you satisfaction. Another one. As I am in want of a husband, would you mind asking all the cowboys you have at the exhibition and those you know in America if they want a wife? And if any of them should happen to be in want of that valuable possession, would you kindly inform me? You can tell them, if they would have me, that I am young, for I'm only 17, with dark hair, blue eyes, rather fair complexion, and a good housekeeper. I wrote on Saturday last asking Texas Jack to meet me, as though I thought I would ask him. But he did not turn up all right. I take the liberty of writing to you. Let me know as soon as possible, if you please, and kindly inform me when the show will leave the exhibition and where it will be going next. So you kind of start to see the emergence of this fan culture, almost kind of, I mean, it's not the right word, but groupies. These people, sort of women who are attaching themselves to these glamorous male cowboys. And in fact, this is the extraordinary sort of result of all of this. A group of girls started to follow the show around from town to town. They ran away from home to follow the Wild West as it toured around the provinces. And this got captured in this wonderful article, which really captures the British anxieties, men's anxieties about what this means for them. It says, it is melancholy to think, writes the Newcastle Chronicle, how shabbily our effete manhood contrasts with that of Mexican Joe and his satellites. We are content to follow the ladies and to fall in raptures at their feet. Mexican Joe and his cowboys, on the contrary, get the ladies to follow them and to prostrate themselves in abject worship before them. No less than 4 young, highly respectable and presumably good-looking damsels, pining for the sight of the burly vanqueros of their choice, have been wandering like so many Rosalinds all the way from Wolverhampton to Sheffield in search of their sombrero-covered Orlandos. It's extraordinary. I mean, so there are all these stories of British girls being kind of wooed and swooning at the sight of that kind of American masculinity of the frontier cowboy. In fact, here's a story, this gets great play in America, where, I mean, I'll give you the sort of brief details. There is George Campbell, who is the son of a very rich rancher in America, so high up in the American social class, decides just to sort of go to Europe for a while. He's an accomplished rider. And for a while he rides with Mexican Joe, I think it was. And during one of these shows, a lady drops a handkerchief. He reaches down out of his saddle at full gallop and pulls it up and gives it to her. And she falls in love with him. A few years later, she's in New York, they're married. So this idea of the cowboy, the American sort of man riding in and sort of sweeping English women off their feet is another kind of fantasy, another kind of thing that's at work here. And you can see that British men are slightly unsure about what this means for them. These are some photos of Texas Jack. That's Texas Jack there, who does have that kind of movie star, matinee idol kind of look to him, even with his sort of long hair. That's Mexican Joe. And this is Daisy, who was the kind of Annie Oakley of the group. They always have the same kind of characters every time. Mexican Joe was a great publicist. Every time they came to town, he tried to marry one of his cowboys off, I think, to a local barmaid or a local woman. And what they would do, they would ride the stagecoach through the town, up to the registry office or the church, make a great show of it. The other thing he would do, whenever he came to town, he had a particular Native American with him who was always described as very dangerous, who he only had on permission from the US government to be with him. And in every town, that Indian would try to kill Mexican Joe. He would shoot at him, he would try and stab him, and yet he still somehow happily just keeps putting him on. I think it was always sort of, isn't it dangerous? Anything could happen. Mexican Joe could be killed at any moment. It's all an act. It's like wrestlers cutting themselves with razor blades to make it look real. There are more. This is Doc Carver, who initially actually sets up with Buffalo Bill, start Buffalo Bill's career in America, but I think, by all accounts, was a bit of a drunkard, a bit of a troublemaker, and never quite made it to the same heights of celebrity. I found him, brilliantly, in the census, staying at a hotel in Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester, in which he lists his profession as, quote, the champion shot of the world. So again, we kind of see this idea of American sort of bragging, of arrogance, as it's perceived in Britain, of tall talk, being very much associated as being an American characteristic. When he arrives in Britain, he immediately sends out a challenge to all the sporting newspapers, claiming he can outshoot anyone in England, puts up an enormous amount of money behind it, and nobody dares take him up on the bet because they just sort of believe this guy, this legend coming out of America. He would. You can kind of see some of the things here. Basically, every single of these images is him shooting something. And it's usually, throwing a glass ball into the air and with a rifle just managing to pick it straight out. It's a real skill involved in this. When he wasn't drunk, he could do it pretty reliably, apparently. So there are these cowboys, and not just Buffalo Bill, not just for a season. Constantly, around Britain, there are these Wild West shows, these performers, sort of arriving and selling the myth of the West, the myth of America, and of the American man, I guess. And this has a real effect. One of the things I found about 2 days ago was of a Methodist church group in Northampton, I think, for their sort of jamboree or bonanza, or bazaar it was, decided to do a Wild West theme. So they were all dressed up as cowboys. One was Buffalo Bill, one was Mexican Joe. The women were all dressed up in sort of, I guess, in dude attire in their own kind of way. And this is like one of the most conservative kind of middle-class groups you can possibly imagine, buying into this myth of the West, making their own version of the Wild West in their church hall. There are, of course, alongside this, at the same time that Buffalo Bill is in London, John L. Sullivan, the American heavyweight champion, who is a genuine celebrity in Britain. When he arrives, people literally go to train stations to see his train go past. He's that famous. He's also in Britain and also kind of demonstrating the power of American masculinity, or that kind of American body, I guess, and beating a lot of British boxers in the process. So there's something interesting going on here, I think, about how Britain starts to deal with the prospect of American competition and what that means. What does that mean for Britain's future? And it's an interesting example of this. I started doing searches in newspapers for articles in which countries like America were mentioned in close proximity to the word competition. This is really inexact. This is by no means a kind of proof of this. But just look at this moment in the 1880s where suddenly the idea of competing with America explodes into the national consciousness. People are suddenly talking about it far more regularly than they were before. It becomes something that can be talked about. And even after that initial panic kind of dies down, it's still 2 to 3 times higher in this period than it had been before. We look at Germany and France, you kind of start to see, anxieties about Germany start to come in the 1890s a little bit more. They don't seem to be worried about France too much for most of the century, I guess, which is an interesting contrast, an interesting way in which Britain defines itself against different national others. Much earlier than this, in the 18th and early 19th century, it would have been France. France would have been the touchstone against which Britain's strength was measured. And what was really interesting about this is that Gladstone, British Prime Minister, takes a look at this situation and very presciently argues in the 1870s that the England and America of the present are probably the two strongest nations of the world, but there can hardly be a doubt, as between the America and England of the future, that the daughter will at some point, some very distant time, will, whether fairer or less fair, be unquestionably yet stronger than the mother. In other words, America is passing us by as if in a canter. It's she alone who at a coming time can and probably will wrest from us our commercial primacy. We must, he says, confront the paramount question of the American future. The height of the British Empire, long before America usurps Britain's place on the world stage, these anxieties are building. Now, interestingly, when Gladstone says this, he's attacked almost universally by the press. The Times describes his prediction as redundant and defective. The Morning Post accuses him of taking revenge against the country for booting him out of office. The Blackburn Standard said these were wild and sinister prophecies. The Daily News, the Liberal, should have been on his side, said these were unfortunate and astounding prophecies. And even the Graphic said that there is no chance that this could ever happen. Even though America does have more land than, as they say, it will never wrest from Britain its position in the world. So there's a hint of anxiety in all of this, of strenuously denying something that maybe they're starting to worry about. But fast forward, this is Anthony John Mandela, one of Gladstone's allies, had to go out on the stump to meetings and basically say, I do not believe in Mr. Gladstone's theory for one moment. I have no fear as to the decadence of England. As long as England remains true to herself, England will grow. So you kind of start to see this they sort of refute this idea that America was on the rise. By the time Gladstone dies in 1900, this idea of an American future, an inevitable American future, was in widespread circulation. There's this book by F.A. Mackenzie called The American Invaders from 1902, which discusses all the ways in which American commerce had sort of invaded England and sort of permeated its commercial culture. W.T. Stead, the great Victorian journalist, publishes this book called The Americanization of the World, subtitled Or the Trend of the 20th Century. He's not just looking forward to the 20th century, he looks back on what has already happened, all of the lands that America has already conquered. Even the Daily News publishes this great article on the great American language, which, as everyone knows, is the language of the future. They even suggest that school children in Britain need to be taught to speak American. In the way that some people will now say that we need to teach our children Chinese, I guess. There is that sense of a shift in an international balance of power. And this happens in this kind of time period. And I think these sort of examples in leisure culture, boxers, meat dressing, these are ways in which this is negotiated. There are some other ones that happen in more literary culture. Oscar Wilde writes, I don't know if you've read this, The Canterville Ghost, in which a modern American family come in and buy an English stately home and immediately terrorise the ghost that lived there. It's a nice reversal of the ghost story. The ghost is the victim in this. And so as soon as they get in there is this, the American says, "My lord, I will take the furniture and the ghost at a valuation. I've come from a modern country where we have everything that money can buy, and with all our spry young fellows painting the old world red and carrying off your best actors and prima donnas, I reckon if there were such a thing as a ghost in Europe, we'd have it at home in a very short time in one of our public museums or on the road as a show." And there are loads of scenes in this. I think in this case, there is this blood stain on the carpet that's been there for centuries, and they immediately say, Pinkerton's champion stain remover will get rid of this. American inventions been the key thing here. Another one, the ghost has these clanking chains that he uses to try and scare the American visitors. They immediately sort of offer him a bottle of Tammany Rising Sun lubricator in order to kind of cure his problems. Very shortly afterwards, Mark Twain, in response, if you like, in this sort of transatlantic battle, I mean, this is, Wilde's text is very much making fun of modern American manners and their brashness. Mark Twain publishes A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, in which a Yankee mechanic is knocked on the head with a spanner and wakes up at King Arthur's Court and proceeds to take over, to Merlin's great frustration, with all of his knowledge of modern technology. So he sets up newspapers, advertising agencies, all this kind of stuff. It's like American modernity championing over England, over British technology. And humour, actually, is one of the key ways in which these relationships are negotiated. Mark Twain is hugely popular in England. Not that book isn't so popular, but most of them are very popular. But there are loads of other American comedians too. This guy, R.G. Knowles, was a huge hit on the music hall stage, one of the real top celebrities of the 1890s and Edwardian period. And the other, I'll zip through this really quickly, but the other context in which American humour was encountered was the press. Joke columns were hugely popular in this time. You start to see them as early as the Chartist press, but pretty soon variety columns of the British press start to include loads of little snippets of American humour and life. This is a variety column from the Press and Chronicle. It contains an item about an Ohio jockey, a Wisconsin father and son, a cemetery in Indiana, a Boston farmer, a murderer from Delaware, a Virginian sheriff, a widower from Illinois, a tramp from Connecticut, and 2 Quakers from New York, all in something that is theoretically nothing to do with America. It's not branded as American, yet you encounter the country in these little snippets. Other newspapers start to introduce regular American joke columns. This is the Newcastle Courant. They have a wit and humour column in 1869. By 1874, it has quite a lot of American material. By later 1876, it has a dedicated American subsection. By 1888, they ditch the British jokes, the old hat, and say, right, we just want American gags from now on. It is kind of taking over. And eventually, these are some other ones of Yankee snacks that they have. In some of the ones like the Hampshire Telegraph, they have British jokes and American jokes next to each other. So you can actually compare the two countries and the strength of their humour. Which one will you laugh at most? It's another context in which the two countries' reputations are negotiated. And really interestingly, these are always branded, the American ones, as American. They're not sort of, by this point, sort of snuck into British humour columns. Their Americanness is celebrated, it's championed. Almost like we would now talk about Belgian chocolates, French champagne. To brand a joke as American in Victorian eyes was to see it as new, fresh, exhilarating. And in fact, you can see some examples here. The Leeds Mercury said, American jokes are refreshing to the jaded brain that is accustomed to wade through the flavourless six-water grog kind of wit of the English comic journals. In other words, even English humour is degenerating, in the face of American modernity. I love this one from the Globe. The best English humourists, they say, are silent now in the 1880s. We are almost compelled, therefore, to go to Yankee writers for the great bulk of our fun. But we go very willingly. We go mainly because we find in the work of our lively cousins so much that is agreeably fresh and individual. It is, we say to ourselves, so unlike anything we can get from our own people. It is so characteristic. It's like roaming about in a new world, a quip and quiddity. In other words, what we shouldn't see here is America just as this hostile challenger to Britain, which is often how the history of Americanization has been written, as this outside force, this invading force, forcing itself on British culture. What you start to see here is the willingness of British audiences to go to America for something, to recognise in it a talent, an aspect of things they liked, an ability to tell a joke. And you see this in the way in which these humour columns are branded. Freshness, newness, modernity is always foregrounded. So Stars and Stripes, the freshest Yankee fun. Laugh and Grow Fat, the freshest Yankee jokes. Fresh fun from the States, the latest shooting yarns. Cuts and slashes from current Yankee wit. Raw Yankee jokes, the freshest from many sources. Breezy Yankee bits, and Yankee fire sparks, fresh from Fun's foundry. It's a bit of a mouthful. But this idea that now America is the place you go to for humour, for jokes, I think it's interesting. Way before Hollywood cinema, we have a distinctive form of American pop culture. These jokes were different. They were based on different styles. They were quicker, snappier, based on more exaggeration. This distinctive American form of pop culture was being imported into Britain in enormous numbers. The most popular papers in the country all have a regular weekly column of American jokes. You get literally thousands, tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of them have been clipped out of American newspapers by British editors. They're not being sold by Americans. American joke writers get no money for any of this. British editors are voluntarily importing this stuff and celebrating its Americans. American, in other words, is not necessarily a hostile, unwanted challenger. It offers something exciting to mass audiences. And I guess that's kind of where I want to finish off. So I think, whenever we look, when American boxers face off against each other, cyclists are racing, I guess we've got to remember that the people watching those contests are embedded in this wider transatlantic leisure culture that emerges, I think, in the final third of the 19th century as connections between the two countries increase. Whether it's through print, through performance, through the Wild West, through theatres, or indeed just through jokes, America and Britain are increasingly coming into contact with one another and trying to figure out what their changing places in the world might be. So, thank you.
Another one bang on schedule. You from fear of God into them. We've got 7 or 8 minutes for any questions.
Yeah. The one thing I'm interested in, going back to the beginning of the presentation, was the relative purchasing power of Britons and Americans. Do you know anything about that, whether British tourists in America would find it expensive? Or
Yeah, I don't know enough specific details about that. It's definitely, I haven't seen anything to suggest that it's talked about as a cheap holiday. I think, certainly compared to travelling to the continent, which seems to be slightly more accessible, I think American, it's still pitched as a thing where you need a great deal of time and money. No, I haven't looked at relative purchasing power enough to be able to sort of tell you on that, I'm afraid. But that'd be an interesting thing to look at, actually, to see. You're right, an experience of an English person arriving and feeling more wealthy there, or as if they have more money and can kind of use that as part of their status there, will be really interesting, actually. So yeah, you're right, I should look into that.
In fact, the American dollar is not yet a real international currency in the early period, so the exchange rate is in Britain's favour.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
In Denmark, the Wild West shows are preceded by the ethnographic caravans, where it's very much about the exotic thing. It's like the same first slide shows they're about traveling in other countries. They make traveling cinemas where you sit in a train wagon and the films, they're displayed on the windows, so you get this feeling of traveling, and that's what they're looking for. And what the Wild West adds, that's the storyline, the drama that suddenly has the attention. And you can say many of the phenomena that you described, with these becoming stars, you have the same with, for instance, when there's a Chinese camp set up in Copenhagen, it's the same about these Chinese men that draw so many women admirers and people are upset about it. I wonder, is that because Denmark do not have the same number of colonies as Britain, that we focus so much on these ethnographic caravans before, and there's this extra twist with the Wild West. Do you have the same caravans in the UK?
Yeah, I'm not specifically on caravans, I don't know, but certainly there are a lot of sort of exhibits being brought in from the empire that are exhibited alongside, and it's exactly those kind of things. Often I've got a student who's working on depictions of freak shows at the moment, and she's very interested in how people from other races are depicted as being essentially freaks, or as these sort of specimens that you can look at and prod. And so there is definitely another sort of side to this of how you encounter the exotic and the foreign through different forms of pop culture. What's different, I guess, about America? I mean, you get that with the Native Americans that travel with Buffalo Bill. One of the things you could do at the Wild West shows was just walk around the encampment and look at them living their lives. It was part of the exhibit. So there is a really strong racial element to a lot of British leisure culture in which the empire looms large. America is slightly different because it has that different status. They are essentially sort of seen as brothers or cousins, as offshoots. So it isn't so much a racial thing. And often there's a lot of talk about actually reuniting the two countries and sort of creating a new English-speaking Anglo-American kind of power. So America sort of poses different problems to those kind of racial exhibits, I think. It's not necessarily about the exotic, it's about figuring out how this offshoot of Britain has fared under new conditions and what this might mean for home. So I think there are actually two different sort of discourses there. There is the exotic imperial things that exactly you talk about, and then America, which is, I think, set aside slightly. But yeah, they're certainly part of the same kind of performance spaces. One season you'll have Buffalo Bill, the next season you will have somebody talking about their encounters in Africa, or a pygmy tribe will be brought over and exhibited and things like that. So yeah, that is going on in Britain as well.
Welcome.
Thanks, Bob. I've really enjoyed it. I'm welcoming over the last several years this emergence of a dialogue rather than a confrontation across the pond, as it were. And I'm wondering about two things, and there's more of a ramble that you might like to comment on than,
Sure.
than a question. And one of them is the place of exotica, and not just the Wild West shows, but exotica in general in this trans and with exotica the grotesque in that kind of transatlantic conversation. And the other one was the whole way through I kept reflecting back on one of the classic feminist sports history texts, which is Pat Vitinsky's work on the scientific dialogue across the Atlantic in the late 19th century about women's physicality. And I'm just wondering how much this transatlantic leisure culture is playing itself out in a whole bunch of other subcultural or specialist dialogues.
Yeah, I'm certain that's true. I mean, the problem I've had with this project is that I keep discovering more of them and more contexts in which this is played out. And you're right, so scientific discourse is absolutely one, and every kind of subfield has its own magazines which are clipping things from America or vice versa. I've talked largely about America coming to Britain here. There is an entire other side of this about British performers and print culture going to America too. I think it's happening at such a pervasive level in almost every kind of discourse that it almost becomes impossible to even sort of start to imagine it or to sort of to discuss it. So yeah, science is definitely one, and print culture is the kind of key enabler for that, and for almost all of these as well, particularly something like that doesn't rely as much on spectacle and performance, that you can have these dialogues, and that is going on, I think, in almost every form of print culture I found at the time. I think about exotica and sort of the vulgar, I guess, and it comes back to P.T. Barnum on this, and that America is always sort of depicted as being a little bit more forward than Britain, not having its manners, its refinement. So in the world of journalism, for a long time, British newspapers will not do interviews if they take place on British soil. They will not print them. But if they take place in America, it's okay. It's seen as an American invention. It's impertinent to ask somebody a question, about what they think. And I think this is a similar thing, this idea that America sometimes, I think, is enjoyed in Britain because it's slightly more comfortable with the grotesque, with the vulgar, with displaying things, or with saying things that you might not get away with in Britain. And what it means for British audiences is that they can always distance themselves from it. They can enjoy it, but then they can say, oh yeah, well, that's what the Americans say. So it allows that slight distancing, that of enjoying the illicit slightly sometimes as well, that I think America enables that. Not to a ridiculous extent, not that America is incredibly vulgar, but I think it allows British people to play with that a bit more. And a great example of it is American slang, which I didn't talk about, but I've done quite a bit of work on as well, about how Americanisms and American language enters Britain at this time through print culture, through performance. And what the British people often do, they love using American slang, British journalists do, but they almost always preface it with, as the Americans say. And it's this great distancing tactic of saying, I'm going to use this word, but don't worry, I know that it's not something an Englishman would say. So there is this kind of interesting negotiation of different sort of cultures going on through that as well, and what America allows you to do by proxy, I suppose.
One last question, Rob.
Thanks. Bob, that was awesome.
Thank you.
I'll keep it quick. To what extent was this reciprocated? So to what extent were the Americans as fascinated with the British?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and because obviously from the moment that America declares its independence, there are these great efforts to say, we don't need Britain, we're a strong independent country and we can look after ourselves and we'll have our own literature, our own culture, and we won't look to London. And yet they are constantly looking to Britain for approval, for recognition. American stars come to Britain, and when they do, when Buffalo Bill is making it big in Britain, you wouldn't believe the amount of press coverage he gets in America, reporting on every member of royalty he's met, everything that's happened to him. So there's still, I think, even amongst those assertions of independence, of their own kind of culture, they're desperately still looking for those moments of approval. Or they're looking for Britain to criticise them and then to make great hay with sort of saying, but what do they know? So it's a complex relationship, a really deeply complex one. There's a great deal of British culture still circulating in America. British musical stars, celebrities, sportsmen. Shakespeare is enormously popular in America. So yeah, by all means, it's definitely a two-way dialogue. And again, just for reasons of trying to maintain my sanity, I'm only looking at one half of it. Maybe that's book two. But yeah, absolutely, it's very much a dialogue. It's I think there's been more written about that, about the way in which British culture is seen as a transmitting culture, you know, particularly in America, perhaps as receptive at this point. And the argument has always been, around about the First World War, the flow reverses. I guess I'm trying to sort of prove that it's been two-way all the time, but you're right, they definitely have a fascination with Britain too.
Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you very much.